Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Jinnah Institute series of webinars. Pakistan is going through tough economic times, which has severely impacted people's ability to thrive and grow economically. There are daily opportunity costs over what to buy, what to invest in, and what to leave out. There are also structural exclusions that prevent households from climbing out of hardship, such as generational poverty. One of the most effective ways to break that cycle is education or new training that can help individuals and households redo their vocational profile and, in the process, increase their earning potential. While this may seem to be the stuff of theory for livelihoods, we have also seen a consistent skills mismatch in Pakistan that inhibits the ability of this young country to integrate into labor markets abroad or even domestically. Jobs of the future are determined by new technologies, including automation and artificial intelligence. But Pakistan seems to be stuck in a low skills, low productivity trap. It also ranks 154th out of 189 countries on the Human Development Index, which speaks to historically low investments in education and healthcare over decades. Most of our labor force works in low productivity sectors whose earnings are also correspondingly low. So, putting all of this in front of you, we thought today we'd have this conversation about upskilling Pakistan's vocational profile, where it currently stands. And we are also speaking just a week after the International Day on World Skills. We are happy to have with us Dr. Faisal Bari, renowned economic expert and teacher at LUMS. We're also happy to have Ms. Ammara Durrani, the Assistant Resident Representative at the UNDP Pakistan and also a Senior Fellow at the Jinnah Institute. I'm Salman Zaidi. I work as Director of Programs at Jinnah Institute and welcome you. Bari Sahab, if we could start the first couple of questions with you. And those are really broadly what Pakistan's current skills profile is at the moment and why it needs to change.
Sivan, thank you very much for the invitation and a very important topic, wonderful topic to go into. I think starting with skills profile, there are three, four major things to keep in mind. One, Pakistan continues to be and will for quite some time be a very young country, which means a lot of people who are in the first 15, 20 years of age. It will also be a country that will continue to produce a lot of children because we still haven't gone through our demographic transition. Another few decades, a couple decades before we do that. It continues to have a fairly high population growth rate and continue to do that. So, like, say, many developed countries like Japan and others where they are more concerned about geriatric concerns and concerns for the old, we actually are still in the area where we're very concerned about what do we have to do for the very young people. For the very young, one of the basic requirements is, of course, education and then transitioning into place of work or skill. Right, in 2017, I think with Adil Najib, we had done the Pakistan UN Human Development Report. It was on youth. And what we had looked at was the basic transitions that young people go through, right? You go into schools, education, then you transition to the workplace, and life and family becomes important. And of course, throughout you are also involved with the community, citizen as a member of that community. So the transitions that young people go through. How do you that? So that's point number 3. Pakistan's education system is terrible. That's the way to describe it. 50 million plus 5 to 16-year-olds are not in schools. And this is a figure of reported plus minus, even if it's a couple of million, what difference does it make? Population larger than the city of Karachi is not in schools in terms of children. Those who are in school are not learning what they should be learning and at the pace that they should be learning. You mentioned, I'll just say one more sentence. You mentioned the mismatch of skills. I think a lot of question there is of if the quality of skills being given is poor, you will always have a mismatch because what you need is somebody who can who has the basic skills and who has the ability to learn new skills as they transition into a job. But if that ability has been hampered by poor quality initial instruction, then how are you going to make that transition for people? So the mismatch is largely also because of this quality and quantity issue in education. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Bari Saab, for mentioning the Human Development Report, which you wrote in 2016. That was a path-breaking work, and that in some ways offered the first baseline of really reviewing where what young people are doing in Pakistan, how they are skilling, and what their whole inclusion in the development project of Pakistan really is. I also like that you've sort of grounded all of this in a lot of evidence. Amara, if I can refer some of that to you. Um, there is a problem of children being out of school, consistently low investments in education, but we are also looking at a rapidly changing international environment that actually has arrived. It's not international anymore. The advent of technology has transformed industry abroad in the region as well as in Pakistan. So there are some sectors integrating more rapidly with the international environment, but stuck with the skills profile that we have, what needs to change for Pakistan's young people in particular to integrate into this?
Thank you very much, Salman. It's a pleasure to be part of this excellent and timely conversation. Timely because we are very well aware of the extremely challenging economic situation that Pakistan is currently going through. Some of the solutions that the policymakers are trying to identify are more fiscal in nature, but I think in your overall context and intro, you clearly linked it to how it is the human resource of a country which can determine the economic direction, its economic direction. Dr. Bari referred to the UNDP Human Development Report on Pakistan's youth. Correctly acknowledging it for really putting the question of youth on the Pakistani consciousness for the first time, and the Pakistani policy puzzle for the first time. That really was a wake up call for the whole country on what to do with the youth bulge. Consequently, UNDP also produced last year the next Human Development Report on the larger question of inequality. And one of the biggest reasons that prompted us to venture into the larger question of inequality, which is more of a red herring question. You never know where to grasp inequality from and where to end it. Was that with this youth bulge within this cohort, the questions of education, the question of employment, the question of skill are all different depending on where you are as a young person, which class you belong to, what is your address, what school you go to, what university you go to, what is your first job, what is your family background. All these disparities and inequalities cut across the youth cohort of Pakistan. I mean, fundamentally, this is the issue that Pakistan is grappling with, that the economic framework of this country is so lopsided, that the opportunities that it has to offer, whatever level they are or whatever number they are so limited that the entire youth, your key point about the international changes towards the knowledge economy, the fourth industrial revolution, essentially, Salman, that you're talking about, very logical, sure, but is Pakistan even featured on that larger economic grid as a country? When you talk about the fourth industrial revolution, is Pakistan counted amongst the top countries of the world who are to be factored as caterers or consumers of the fourth industrial revolution, especially in terms of productivity, especially in terms of human talent to offer into to for that industry? No, unfortunately not. And it's besides the point that, recent statistics have shown that we have our freelance, our growing freelance component in the human resource market is a wonderful silver lining. Exceedingly larger number of youngsters are entering the freelance market, but even that is such a small cohort to compete with more competitive economies like China, like India, like even at the regional level, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan. Sri Lanka. If you compare how the young population, the talent pool, the skills on offer from these countries are being consumed by the client countries in the fourth industrial revolution, we will see that Pakistan is not amongst the top three talent pool offerers. And so therefore it begs the question that when a young person is graduating from high school, what are the career options for him or her? And I'm only talking about those who have the luxury of that education. We are not even in our policy discourse, especially on education, we are not even factoring the 35+% of Pakistan's NEET youth who are neither employed nor educated nor engaged. More than 35% of Pakistan's young population is the not engaged, not educated, not employed youth. And that is in the underbelly of Pakistan, that is in those poorest districts of Pakistan, the underdeveloped parts of Balochistan, rural Sindh, South Punjab, the backwaters of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Who is catering for those youth? Will they ever be able to join the bandwagon of digital transformation that has offered an opening for the top echelons of Pakistan's most privileged and trained youth? So I think the current economic logjam that Pakistan is faced with, my fear, my fear is that that has even lessened the opportunities, that will further decrease the opportunities for growth and for learning, because the fiscal space is shrinking so much, the industry sectors have decreased so much. You have very little space now to offer for skilled youth. That will be the challenge.
Thank you, Ammara, for that extremely sobering overview, but full of symbolism there. Debunking the myth that Pakistan's youth is its greatest advantage and has the greatest potential. I mean, that story needs to be put to bed eventually. That a skilled youth that is not skilled, not educated, eventually leads to a liability in more ways than we care to count. My question would be then, is the onus continuously then on the young person to find their way out of unemployment, out of the backwaters, as Amara said, of our provincial hinterlands? Is the onus constantly on the poor person to fight their poverty and overcome their hardship? What else is in the supply chain for these young people? What is on the supply side at all? And Barisa, I mean, you've mentioned education, but you've also looked at TEFTA and these other organizations in some detail. Could you tell us what's on offer from the government to re-equip Pakistan's skills profile?
Okay, Salman. So, big question. Again, uh, I'll answer it in three ways. One, um, it's very hard for a poor person to break poverty if they don't have access to two kinds of savings. One, either financial, and second, investments of human capital. Right. So, for a person who doesn't have any financial savings, they and whose children or who themselves and their children do not have education to create human capital, to ask them to acquire it somehow without having any access to capital is impossible, almost impossible, right? Because our schooling system, as I said, even if they reach the schooling system is of poor quality. For most people, your access is determined by, as Amara also said, determined by who you are, how rich you are, where you are, gender, caste, a lot of other things. And so to expect the poor to break this cycle on their own is very hard, which is why the world over you have to have injections of capital for them. And injections are two kinds. One, if you're giving financial and other resources that can help now can increase their envelope for consumption as well as investment. And if you're providing education, that can help for the next generation to at least break the cycle for the next generation. So that has to come from outside. So that's one level. The second level is that the problem is that, which you have mentioned at this very start, when you started this discussion. Historically, our state and society has not invested enough in education, health, and social sectors. Right? Even today, we are only spending 1.7 odd percent of GDP on education. 1.2% last year we spent, even despite COVID, on health, whereas the recommended number are in 4 5% and so on. So we are not investing enough in education, and that's just a fact. Now, why is that? Is a good question to ask. There are other countries with similar levels of development, with similar growth profiles, similar income profiles, who have been able to invest a lot more in education. The example of Asian tigers, we have seen China bring 400, 500 million people out of poverty over the last few decades. We have seen India do this. Now we are seeing Bangladesh increasingly do this. And so it's not, the argument is not that we don't have the resource, the money. The argument largely is that the prioritization of policies in Pakistan is in a way that does not produce inclusive policy, does not work for the majority of the people. I'll just mention two very good texts to have a look at. One is, of course, the 2013 Esimoglu and Robinson Why Nations Fail, where they talk about the importance of institutions, etc. But more importantly, I think a recent text by Stephen Durkon, which is about gambling on development, which says that the elites of the country have to create a development bargain that allows for medium to long term investments into medium to long term policies for larger numbers of people, for more, having more inclusion rather than just the. And the question really is, countries are able to do that, others are not able to do that. The answer lies in the political economy of that country. And I think our political economy has been dominated by elites, however you define elites of military, bureaucracy, business, land, and so on. And so our policy structures have and policy choices usually favor the elites as opposed to the larger population. Now, given that, it's very hard to see change that you're talking about, Salman. Yes, there are the TAVTAs and NEPTECs and everything else is there, and PSDF and so on, but they are very small. They don't even reach a fraction of the children that we want them to reach, and they don't have the wherewithal to offer the kind of trainings, etc., which needed by what is called now the changing fourth 4.0 education 4.0 and so on and so forth. So I don't expect the state to do much, and that's, it's very pessimistic look, I know. Sadly, till the political economy changes substantially, my feeling is we'll continue this bandit sort of approach. We'll have small programs continuing. We'll keep talking about Jawan Pakistan and better Pakistan and this Pakistan. But unless the basic political economy structure changes substantially so that policies become a lot more inclusive and for the people, I don't see that change happen for the moment.
Thank you, sir, for that. I think a foregrounding of the larger political economy around questions of what our institutions can do is very key to this discussion. I'd like to also talk about institutions in the private sector and what they're able to do. So if deindustrialization is going on, as is a widespread fear, or if the private sector is unable to create the jobs that we need, then where shall Pakistan's young people go? Even if they acquire the skills, and this is not just talking about those who've been left out of high-paying skills, high-paying jobs, those who do have degrees and the skills feel the need to branch out of the country very soon. So what is the private sector able to do is one question, and overall, where is the industry in its assistance or help towards this? So my question is to both of you. Ammara, would you like to go first?
Thank you, Salman. That's a great question. In fact, this it's one of the points that Faisal Saab also referred to, and I wanted to specifically talk about the role of business. In Pakistan, arguably, state is the largest employer per se. State remains the largest source of employment in Pakistan, institutionally. Business is next, and business, then again, one has to understand that the private sector in itself is very layered. It's very multidimensional. There's the formal private sector, there's the informal private sector, there's the global FMCG, international FDI investors private sector, there's the local businesses, there's the local industries, 3 4 tiers of private sector. And therefore I'm deliberately using the word business private for private sector, non-state business sector. uh, that has remained an underutilized, under-engaged sector. Whatever breakthroughs in terms of technology, in terms of modern skill building, in terms of modern retention and employment of young people and their growth across industry, that credit goes to the business sector in Pakistan. Especially with the advent of the FMCGs in the 1990s, with economic liberalization, employers like McDonald's, like KFC, like Telenor, like Mobilink, these are every young Pakistani's dream employers. Why? Not because of the brand value that they symbolize, but because of the sheer investments that these businesses make in their employers, in their employees. From training to growth to mentorship to career paths, it's a whole package of aspirational growth. And then when you look at the growing services industry, that is also a testament of the incredible promise and potential that business has to offer for rightly using young people. It's a question of leveraging young people, but are you leveraging them rightly or not? Business has demonstrated that private sector knows how to rightly leverage. So this whole new source of employment, that bike riders who are bringing our food and our groceries at our doorstep, and nothing like COVID demonstrated that the sheer power and potential of this segment of employment and purpose for young people, gainfully employed, purposefully employed for young people. Nothing demonstrated than COVID of how the delivery man became the most important person for everyone, and it still is. Who is investing in this? It's the business sector, not the state. It's the business sector's investments who have pushed the frontiers of 21st century employment, 21st century skill diversification of young people, regardless of their educational status. Business has the know how, the solutions, the needs mapped out, and they offer a complete suite of from training to apprenticeship to employment to growth. The problem in Pakistan is that the state has never understood the private sector as it ought to. Even today, if you talk to the private sector, their chief grievance is, where are the incentives for us to invest in human capital? Where, with such a shrinking fiscal space, it is so difficult for us to manage our profit lines. How can we take up those social responsibility agenda? I think there needs to be a very intensive, structured emergency dialogue initiated by the state with the private sector, that the current economic challenge is not for any one party to hold or manage responsibly and effectively. The business sector will need to step in and take up the burden of the youth unemployment, but the business sector will need to be engaged professionally. The business sector would need to be understood. You cannot attract private sector investments with a heavy handed, state heavy, state above everything approach. You need to become business minded to be able to leverage business to take care of the socio-economic burdens that you're trying to manage as a state, of which young employment, engagement, and skills is the number one, arguably.
Thank you, Ammara, for that sharp key questions there about how to incentivize the business and private sector, and whether this whole business of investing in human capital has been outsourced inadvertently over Pakistan's history. Bari Sahib, I'd like to refer that question to you again about the role of the private sector, but also if you could address the whole impact of COVID and the gender differential that has emerged over COVID, and the wage pay gaps, other issues, retrenchment of women from the labor force, as well as any recommendations that you might want to make towards this.
Salman, so the first thing, I think there is no doubt that a sort of a premature deindustrialization has taken place. If you talk to a lot of businesses, they prefer being in trade rather than in manufacturing in Pakistan, because the incentives are set in a way that being a manufacturer here in Pakistan is much harder now, with a lot more risks involved and so on. And so, to a certain extent, what Ammara was saying, that needs to look into what sort of incentives are provided in different sectors, and why is manufacturing feeling that pressure over time of slowly moving away from manufacturing and into trade, etc. That doesn't mean that we have the same growth path as some of the 50s, 60s countries that developed in the 50s and 60s. I don't think we can go back to that time and say industry is the only way to go through development, but it has a role, and it has a large role, and there should be effort to make sure that we have appropriate incentives in that. Having said that, the biggest growth we've seen, and that will continue to be, has been in the service sector. And finally, to come to the gender issue, one of the biggest puzzles in the sense of look, over the last 2-3 decades, we have educated a huge number of young people. You see the cohort effect in our education data very clearly, right? Mothers were not educated, daughters are. Sons are educated, fathers were not as educated. So there has been a tremendous change. An expansion in enrollments did happen, and even completion rates, etc., responded a bit, and so on. But the problem comes that our female labor force participation rate is one of the lowest in the world. I mean, it's much low, and it's not about Islam, because there are other Islamic countries that have much higher rates, whether it be Bangladesh or Turkey or whatever. It's not about South Asia, because other neighbors in South Asia also have higher rates and so on. So, but what happens, there is a huge number of women that get educated, whether metric, FA, BA, and afterwards they are not able to join the workforce, and that creates a major problem for us. I think if you want to really transform Pakistan, finding ways of making the job market and the work market much more equitable across genders could has the potential to transform Pakistan significantly. And I mean, it is. I think it's underappreciated. I'll give done. Look at the medical college admission issue, right? At some point, we had to actually think about, okay, should we have quotas for women, because there was a lot more women coming. If they then go on to go into medicine and actually are able to practice, rather than drop out because of X factor or Y factor or Z factor, this could potentially transform our education, health, service sector, all sectors in which and obviously both men and women should be working, right? So a lot of thinking needs to go into how do you what is the role of the state in changing some of these socio-cultural parameters also, so that the society becomes inclusive, not in terms of just have and have nots, but in terms of gender, caste, geography, rural, urban, all of those caveats as well.
In our final round of questions, Amara, would you like to come in with any recommendations and speak to some of what Bari Saab has said?
Gee, thank you, Salman. I think I want to pick up for my final comments. I want to pick up on Faisal's last point about the urgent need to explore what the social sector has to offer. You see, and Faisal Saab's very pertinent point on the need to change the mindset of how we view youth. We need to stop looking at youth only as employees, only as money makers or money earners. We need to start looking at youth as builders of a constructive social order. Okay, if you're going to start looking at youth in that social entrepreneurial way, beyond a job, what is their purpose? What is their societal purpose? What is their community purpose? When you look at countries like Turkey, you look at Latin American countries, you look at East Asian countries, there you will see a lot of innovation has happened. How some of these markets, the Asian tigers, which are now doing so much better than Pakistan in terms of economic growth, they manage to take the societal societal development aspect along with the economic growth one as best as they can. And when you travel across these societies, you see that the youth in these countries are much more settled, much more socially aware, much more positively contributing to maintaining a peaceful, harmonious social order, community service, neighborhood services, care economy, psychosocial support, voluntary action, a lot of that. I have to commend the previous government for its Green Pakistan initiative, in which they very thoughtfully built a component of engaging the youth for creating an environmental consciousness in Pakistan. Now that is the kind of policy approach you need, where you give some kind of a purpose to you, that we are not just looking at you as money earners, as GDP growth factors, but we are looking at you as agents of constructing a good, healthy society. So, for instance, if some kid does not want to have a full-time job, if some kid does not want to be an executive or an industry worker, if some kid is a sensitive kid who wants to work in, say, psychosocial sector, and by the way, there is no such sector in Pakistan. It's very sporadic initiatives, NGO led initiatives, where you have these little pockets of psychosocial support officers who give psychological support to victims of trauma, victims of violence. There's so much violence in the society. There's such an underexplored area of psychological care. Youth can be really engaged in that. We have recently discovered that in Gilgit Baltistan, for instance, and that is one of the more educated areas of Pakistan, more, how should I say, gainfully employed areas of Pakistan. And yet, at this point in time, Gilgit Baltistan is suffering from a very traumatic and very puzzling increasing suicide rate amongst its youth. And we are at UNDP, we're beginning to understand and get into the root causes of why in that part of Pakistan, ostensibly good education, better opportunities, why are youth feeling despair, or why do they want to end their lives? This is, we shouldn't just be talking about employment skills, we should also be talking about social survival skills. societal development skills, resilience skills, analytical skills, critical skills, community engagement skills, policy engagement skills. I think when you create more diversity, and I think this is what our youth desperately need right now, they feel that they are trapped. There are very few avenues for growth, too much competition for too little jobs, very few courses on offer. Although the needs of society have changed and diversified so much, come up with new social problems, create trainings and skills according to those social problems, and create a value chain of economy and purposefulness for the young people according to those new emerging needs of society. And I think this is how you may be able to salvage some of those neat youth, some of those unengaged youth who feel that they have absolutely no stake in the game.
All extremely pertinent points, Amara, and great that we've created a 360 view of the situation where it's not just skills for livelihood, the skills, the many skills that you have mentioned, which help a more robust existence within society. I'd like to hear from Bari Saab, and Bari Saab, you have the last word on this. Any recommendations from you on the economic front or other fronts, the socio-economic, as Amara has pointed out? Over to you, sir.
So it's a tough one in the sense that I think right now the most of the attention of policymakers is focused on yet again the macroeconomic crisis and what needs to happen very quickly in the short term. But I think what this cycle of crisis relief that we've been living for the last couple of decades has done is that it has not allowed the society to have a deeper dialogue on what sort of medium to long term policies need to be followed in the areas of education, health, social sector, creating the skills, creating the platforms that youth need for creating entrepreneurship, so on. And I think that we have to somehow move away from. We have to start thinking about what is it that Pakistan wants to achieve in the next decade, decades, 3 decades in terms of investments, policy options, etc., that we put in place now over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and then let them run for that period at least before we start talking about the benefits that might accrue. It's not going to happen in a day or so. So my biggest recommendation, policy recommendation, is an urging society and policymakers to start thinking long term and deeper. By just moving from short term policy to another, there is no evidence, in fact, quite a bit of evidence contrary to that, that short term policy making undermines some of the long term objectives that we have for this society.
Thank you, Bari Saab, for that insight. My key takeaways for this discussion is that as Bari Saab said, that the elite bargain needs to change in favor of creating greater investments in human capital. And unless we're able to determine the view that the conceit that we will be providers of benefits to young people, and this whole sort of feeling of patronizing youth in Pakistan also needs to be done away with by positioning young people and seeing them as agents of actual change. And unless we are able to create that dynamic within Pakistan, we will be relegating them in situations where they will eventually fall into unproductive uses of time, violence, other things. And that's a thought for Pakistan as it marches on several years after partition, but also increasingly looking at its youth bulge, which is not providing the dividend that it was meant to. I thank the participants of this discussion today, and I hope that these views carry to policymakers who are listening to this webinar. Thank you for joining us, and hope to see you another time. Khudafis.